So I do want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon, evening, morning, whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is Patrick Stenshorn. I am the Director of Interpretive Programs at the Albany Institute of History and Art. This is the third in the series of programs entitled Artistic Insights with LF Tantillo, which are monthly talks related to the exhibition, A Sense of Time, the Historical Art of LF Tantillo, which is currently on display at the Albany Institute. I do want to thank all of you as well. I apologize for the postponement last week, but I do appreciate everybody's understanding and being able to come back this weekend. So I do want to make sure that I thank everybody who has joined us today and who was expecting to join us last week, and for your understanding in that sudden change. Today, I am joined on this call by Victoria Waldron, who is the museum's museum educator. She is on the account entitled Albany Institute of History and Art Education. If you do have a technical issue during today's program, she will be the best person to help you troubleshoot. Today's presentation has been pre-recorded, and I will be sharing it through my screen. So if a message comes through to me during the presentation, I may not see it. So she will be the best person to reach out to today. For today's presentation, please make sure that your microphone is on mute. If you are using a device that has a webcam on it, feel free to have your webcam turned on or off, whichever you are most comfortable with. At the end of today's pre-recorded presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Len is on live with us this afternoon. So if you do have a question about today's presentation, about Len's work in general, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and I will moderate all questions at the end of today's program. Before I give a brief introduction for Len, I wanted to give you a chance, if you wanted to say any quick words before we get started with the recording portion of today's presentation, I'd like to give you an opportunity to do so.
Thanks, Patrick. I'd like to just thank everybody for all those wonderful emails wishing Corliss well. She did have a fall and she did break her wrist, and she's not in any pain right now, but anticipating a recovery. There's going to be a surgery on Tuesday. But anyway, it was really nice to hear from so many of you, and I'm glad that you stuck by and decided to go along with this postponement. So anyway, thank you very much. It was greatly appreciated by both of us.
Yes. So thank you, Len. And I'm very sorry to hear about Corliss's fall, and I hope she's feeling better, and I hope the surgery goes well. So
I think the worst part of the fall was that I have to cook now, and Cor is really getting sick of mashed potatoes and spaghetti.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah.
All right, so to get us started today, I'll give a brief introduction. I know many of you know Len, but I'll give a brief introduction, and then I'll begin today's presentation, and then at the end we will host our Q&A session. So Len Tantillo is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. He is a licensed architect who left the field of architecture to pursue a career in the fine art of historical and marine painting. Since that time, his work has appeared internationally in exhibitions, publications, and film documentaries. He is a fellow of the American Society of Marine Artists. His work is included in the collection of museums such as the Fenimore Art Museum, the Minnesota Museum of Marine Art, the Albany Institute of History and Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and numerous historical societies and corporate and private collections throughout the United States and internationally. Over his career, he has produced hundreds of paintings and drawings of New York State history. And in 2016, he was elected a fellow of the New York Academy of History. Today's presentation will be focusing on the British colony of New York and the Americans in the new United States. So please enjoy today's presentation, and we will host a question and answer session at the end.
Welcome to a series of videos presented by the Albany Institute of History and Art to accompany the exhibition, A Sense of Time, the Historical Paintings of L.F. Tantillo. My name is Len Tantillo. Part 3 is going to focus on the English and the Americans and the formation of a new nation. And we'll be dealing with a time period from 1664 to around 1790. So kind of picking up where we left off in part 2, I thought that we should sort of take another look at this diagram. During the Dutch era, they were pressured on all sides. The English colony was divided between Massachusetts and Virginia, and the French were very well established in Quebec and beyond, and the Dutch were sort of caught in between. Stuyvesant had requested help from the Netherlands. He needed to improve the fortifications if he was going to defend the colony against this, what he perceived to be inevitable onslaught. He never received the support or the funding that he needed, and when the English during the reign of Charles II decide to take New Netherland, Stuyvesant surrenders and the colony becomes English. Once the English are established here, the problems that have been occurring in Europe, the pressures, the competition, outright wars between France and England are just kind of transplanted to North America. For the entire 120 plus years of British rule, it's a period of time that's marked by conflict and hostility, the danger of war and actual war. The interesting thing is that caught in between this conflict were the native people who lived here long before the Europeans ever arrived. And they were a force to be dealt with, but more importantly, to establish alliances with. So both the French and the English tried to form connections with tribal groups. For some of the tribes in the area, at different times, that meant victory and success. For others, defeat. But ultimately, in the end, it was a disaster for all of the Native Americans of North America and America. There are not very many maps of, or drawings for that matter, of the Albany area in the 17th century and the 18th century. We have a drawing that's attributed to Anthony Burgess that depicts Albany in the early 1700s. And back in the 1980s, I was tasked with the challenge of doing a pen and ink drawing of what Albany may have looked like as a stockaded city. Well, the Burgess view does give a sense of the layout of the city, but probably more accurately was the work of a British colonel. Wolfgang Romer was a surveyor and an engineer, and he had been dispatched to North America by the English government to map out the locations where it was felt military installations needed to be upgraded. And one of the maps, one of several maps that Romer made was this one of Albany in the late 1690s. And it's an incredibly well-drawn map. The scale is very accurate. On close inspection, this map, the street layout of the Romer map completely corresponds with the street map of Albany today when you make adjustments for slight changes in the paths of certain streets like Broadway. So it's a great bit of reference. And one that I relied on very heavily. And then I embellished it with the information that I could get from the Burgess view, and this is the pen and ink drawing that I made. You can clearly see that Albany is a stockaded city. At the top of the hill is the fort. It went by several names, Fort Frederick. At some point in time it was also called Fort Albany. In the previous episode, we talked about the Dutch fort, Fort Orange. That was down on the river, and it would be out of this picture on the left-hand side. Romer also made a map of Schenectady around the same time, and I was commissioned to do a painting of Schenectady. Initially, the idea was that I was being asked to do a painting of the Schenectady Massacre. And it was a project that I couldn't get very interested in because of the horrible nature of what took place there. It was a catastrophe. So instead of depicting the actual massacre, we agreed that it would be acceptable if I did a painting of the way Schenectady looked shortly before the massacre took place. Well, this map from Romer was very helpful. If you look at it in detail, you can see the Mohawk River, the Binnakill Creek, and the Cowhorn Creek. This large overlay of a fort was Romer's suggestion. This map was drawn after the Schenectady Massacre, and he is sending back his recommendation to build a much larger, much sturdier fort. The actual fort that was there at the time of the massacre is much smaller. You can see it right here, and it had a palisade wall that extended from a corner of one of the bastions into the Mohawk River, and a palisade wall that extended kind of across the what would be the eastern boundary of the city to the Cowhorn Creek. And he also gives us a sense of buildings and even some building details. So there was enough data in this drawing for me to make this is a pretty crude digital model, but it was enough for me to develop into painting of Schenectady in the winter of 1690 on a February night shortly before the French attacked the city. I think it's interesting to point out that France and England are involved in this conflict in Europe, and they're involved in this in a conflict here in North America, and they're bringing terrible pressures on the communities within their colonies. And in this case, the French attack Schenectady. The English aren't really there to protect Schenectady with any great force. Most of the residents in Schenectady at that time were Dutch, and it was the Dutch that paid the price for the attack. In addition to the maps of Wolfgang Romer, as I mentioned, they're very, very accurate, lots of information. There was another cartographer who made a number of maps around the same time period, like the late 1690s, approaching 1700, and his name was John Miller. He was a minister, and you can see the Miller maps aren't anywhere near the level of sophistication of the Romer maps, especially when you compare them. Although Miller does get a number of things, as crudely as he draws them, pretty accurate. If you compare the two forts, the two renditions of the English fort, it had a very distinct bastion. One of the corner bastions was rounded. It was a powder magazine, and you can see that both of these map makers show that detail. And even though Miller's is out of scale, he does give a sense of the shape of the stockade. So he's not entirely, it's schematic, but it's not incorrect. Well, the problem with the primitive nature of Miller's maps became something that I had to deal with when I was commissioned to do a painting of Kingston, New York in the 1690s. This is a little later map of Kingston in the 1770s. The reason why I am showing this map is because of the layout of the streets, and also this very large and well-defined mill pond, which you'll see a little bit later. The area that was stockaded is indicated there in red, and some of the names of the people that lived in and around Kingston at that time are named on the map. So this is Miller's 1695-ish plan of Kingston, New York. And you can see that it has bastions on the corners, and there's an obvious layout of streets. He has schematically depicted the inner courtyard areas of these blocks, which would have been divided up into gardens. There's information here, but again, it's kind of crude. This is a redrawn version. In the redrawn version, the names of the streets within the stockaded area have been placed on the map. Those are the streets that are in Kingston today. So you can kind of orient yourself between the Miller drawing and the contemporary street map of Kingston. That's what we're looking at here. This is a tax map of Kingston, current tax map of Kingston. And so what I tried to do is I tried to relate the Miller diagrammatic map to an actual street plan. And I did this by placing the streets, locating what may have been the outer perimeter of the stockade, and then placing the same number of houses in approximately the same places that Miller is showing on his diagram. And then kind of finishing it off with some of the terrain features, the streams and creeks that surrounded the community. That large stream that you see at the top of the picture is the Esopus Creek. But there's some real interesting aspects of this map that that really surprised me. One of them was that triangular block. Very distinct feature that's there in Kingston today. And I studied it carefully. If you look at that block today and you place the property lines today, the parcel outlines today, where those various properties are located now in 2021, and you put the buildings on it from the Miller map, it is incredibly accurate, which really surprised me. I think that's such an interesting. I don't think it's coincidental. I think Miller was actually trying to get it right. So it was helpful, and it lent credibility to some of what Miller was trying to indicate. There's another aspect of Miller's drawing when you look at it closely, is he's shaded in the buildings differently. Some of the buildings have lines that are perpendicular to the street, and some have lines that are parallel with the street. And I was sort of wondering, is he trying to indicate the direction of the gable of the roof of the house? It just seems so deliberate. So taking all of that data, the information from the Miller map and my conjectural assumptions, locating the mill pond from the earlier map, this is the model, and from that model I created the painting for the New York Department of Historic Sites. So you see the stockade and the mill pond, the street layout and the density of the community, how it's set into the landscape. And I find it, I mean, it was a shock to me that Kingston was this much of a town. I grew up in that part of Ulster County. I grew up in New Paltz and been in and out of Kingston my whole life, and knew about its history during the Revolutionary War, but the earlier time period I knew nothing about, and up until recently the only reference there was the Miller map. So creating this image of it was as much of a surprise to me as it is to people who are seeing it for the first time. Recently, I also had an opportunity to do a painting of my hometown of New Paltz in Ulster County. And this painting was quite speculative, but based pretty heavily on the archaeology that was done by Joe Diamond and some of his students from the SUNY College in New Paltz. And Joe had done a number of excavations there, and he found a number of very interesting features. Now this is long before New Paltz has the stone houses, so we're moving back. This is in New Paltz in the 17th century, not in the 18th century. So we're looking at maybe the 1680s or the 1690s. It's a French Huguenot community, heavily influenced by the Dutch, but it is being built in the era of the English. And what Joe found was evidence of a pit house, some possible suggestion of construction, maybe a barn, but I think, and also a very clear outline of a pole building, a house. And and the edges of a perimeter stockade, indicating that this was somehow a protected community. So where to start? You know, if that's all the information you have, what was I going to do with this? Well, I took the drawing that Joe had made of the stockade post molds, and on it I projected the house post molds that he had found to scale. And then digitally, I created a perspective view, and from the perspective view I popped up the posts from the post mold locations. And from this I could see the red color indicates the stockade wall, the yellow the house, and the blue possible observation platform of some kind. Not exactly a bastion, but probably was armed, more of a lookout. And then here is that same model at an angle. And from this, I developed some conjectural sketches. That corner structure, that observation tower, and the stockade wall, and the house. The tower, I thought about the tower as kind of a guard house, which would mean you'd have to get supplies up there. That's why I added the little crane. It probably had some kind of weapon, maybe a swivel gun or something like that. And if I just imagined that if there was a sentry posted there in all kinds of weather, that it might be covered. So that's how I came up with that look for that structure. The house was a little different because we do have examples of these French style post in the ground. That's the Pateau en terre style. There are some examples of this in Canada, and so and Joe had found things like possible windows and doorways. So this pencil sketch is a direct reflection or an interpretation of Joe's work. And then I knew that it was going to have a number of other elements. I know what the surroundings in New Paltz look like because I live there. So what you see is the familiar Schwangunk Ridge with its tower. That's where the resort, the Mohawk Resort is located. In the center, you see that's a pit house that I photographed in the Netherlands at the Open Air Museum in Arnhem. There's a structure that's a model that someone made of a French-style post house, a tower with some kind of protective roof. I knew there was going to be livestock there. I knew the livestock would be just wandering around, not particularly penned up. I knew there were slaves there. We have an account of the slaves, some of the slaves who were in New Paltz at that time, and I knew there would be workers there with the construction that was ongoing. And then putting all of that together, I created this painting of what I think New Paltz may have been like in that 1680, 1690 time frame. And you can see all those elements that we were talking about and how they kind of work into the scene. Sometimes the materials that I have access to are really interesting and quite unusual. A few years ago, I was commissioned by Don and Ann Eberly, who decided that they were going to sponsor a painting that was to be gifted to the Albany Institute of History and Art. And we had a number of meetings and to just discuss various ideas and in what time period I would place the painting and what the basis for the painting would be. And a story started to emerge from an artifact. It seems that an antique dealer in England had an artifact of unknown origin that they were trying to sell in England, and once it was examined, it was determined that it wasn't connected so much with England, but it had some kind of connection with New York State. The artifact was the transom of a small vessel, most likely a longboat. And it had these distinct features. It had a pair of greyhounds or dogs, a shield, and the shield had a number of very distinct icons within it, and a slogan on a banner under it. And when it was closely examined, it was determined to be the coat of arms of George Clinton's family. George Clinton was the Lord of Lincolnshire. And you can see all those elements there, the greyhounds, the stars and crosses within the center motif, and the crown. When you compare them, it's clearly represents that family. So the Albany Institute was able to acquire this piece, and we thought that it would make a great basis for a painting of Albany in the time when the Lord of Lincolnshire, George Clinton, was the provincial governor of New York. We know a bit about the activities of the provincial governor. We know that he made a trip to Albany, and in the 1740s. We know quite a bit about the trip because there is a document that was drawn up by the owner of a sloop who was charged with towing Clinton's small boat up the Hudson River, and Clinton's boat was loaded with gifts that were going to be given to the tribes of the Iroquois. The political idea that Clinton had was to create a stronger bond between the English and the Iroquois, with the understanding that there was trouble brewing with the French in Canada, and the more resources he had to fend off or attack the French, the better. So we have a list of a number of things that the sloop owner, Abraham Dow, was asked to do. He was asked to paint his vessel. He was asked to reflag it. So with that information, we know that this occurred. The vessels, those two vessels, made their way up here because we not only have Dow's bill to the governor, but we have the governor's letter to the Admiralty in England requesting reimbursement for that trip. And he specifically mentions going to Albany with more than one vessel. So to kind of come up with what to do with this image, there were a few really good references. This is a painting at the Albany Institute, and I wasn't so interested in the figure in the painting, but more in that depiction of the sloop in the background, because we're talking about that time, and the sloop is quite distinct. It's got a very rounded stern. It's flagged with English flags, and it's towing a vessel behind it. So this sort of became the idea for possibly how Dow towed Clinton's smaller vessel up the river. So what is this? I mean, what kind of a vessel is this? What vessel has a transom as ornate as that in that scale? Well, I found a model in a collection in England and at the Royal Maritime Museum of a longboat. And the interesting thing about this model, the model was made in the 1740s, but the interesting thing about the model was that the stern was carved. And I thought this could very easily be the type of vessel that Clinton was towing to Albany. It just looks so much like it. The shape of that transom is so similar. I decided that if it was that vessel, it's considered a longboat. I found period plans of a longboat, and then using the dimensions of the artifact at the museum, I built a digital model of it. I worked out the framing of the longboat, the decking, the planking, and that's how I came up with that detail in the painting. I took some artistic license with the painting of the carving. And so the scene, sort of the focus of the scene is that the sloop and the longboat loaded with gifts for the Indians. And in the greater view of the painting, you can see Albany in the background and a few other vessels on the eastern shore of the Hudson River. Depicting Albany in the background was a challenge. This is a map of Albany that was drawn in the 1750s. This is a great map. It took a while to find a really good copy of this that I could blow up and study carefully. And at first I was confused by the numbers that you see on the street lines of the city, and I came to find out that what the cartographer was indicating there were the number of houses that face that street. Great bit of information in determining the density of this city, the texture of the city. Some of the buildings I knew something about already. The church at the foot of State Street and the English fort at the top of the hill. The stockade had changed a bit from the Romer maps, but you could clearly see it was still there in the 1750s. And so I applied the number of buildings digitally to the map from 1750. And that was how I determined what the background would look like, the density of Albany in that 1740 window of time. Well, we've been talking about the English in New York, and I had an opportunity to do a painting, a Canadian painting, about 1.5 years ago for the Minnesota Marine Art Museum in Winona, Minnesota. It was a great opportunity. They gave me pretty much free rein over what the Canadian subject would be, and I thought, wow, this is an opportunity to take a look at Quebec in the 1740s. It's still New France. And this is the capital city, and a place that has such a strong historical connection with the history of New York State. So I undertook the project to do a depiction of Quebec in the 1740s, and there are numerous drawings and maps that were left and created by the English after they had taken New France. So it was basically a question of interpreting these, trying to figure out what these maps are indicating. And then, studying whatever drawings or paintings I could find that showed aspects of the low town, the middle town, and the high town, because Quebec is built on a series of hills. And this was the image that I came up with. So you can see Fort Lewis and the governor's house pretty clearly there, probably the major building. The low town, which if any of you have been to Quebec, still pretty much the same. The church that you see there, still in existence. You can walk through the square. The Plains of Abraham there at the top. Yeah, some of the things that were challenging about this piece is that I was quite familiar with the vessels of the Dutch, and I was quite familiar with the vessels of the English, but not so much with the vessels of the French or the vessels that the French were using in Quebec. So it took a bit of work to figure out what to do with this, but I think this is a fair representation of Quebec in that era. 1750s is when the conflict escalates to the 7 Years' War. And this is an interesting map, because I don't think that most of us have a sense of the land area that was occupied by the French in the 1750s. It's not just Canada, it extends all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. The English have pretty much total control of the Atlantic seaboard, but that edge where the boundary between those two national colonies exists is the boundary of obvious war. This is a painting I made of Lake George, the assault by Montcalm's French regulars and Canadian militia, accompanied by Huron Indians, against Fort William Henry, a holdout of the British and the Americans. And this is the shelling of the fort. Probably one of the most significant assaults, sieges, that took place during the French and Indian War. It's been memorialized and romantically becomes the theme of James Fenimore Cooper's book, The Last of the Mohicans. The actual assault and what took place is quite fascinating. It's probably too much for me to get into in this program, but you get an idea of what the 1750s were about, and the conflict that was going on at that time. Saratoga is a project that I've been interested in for a while. When you use the term, when somebody hears the name Saratoga, it's known all over the country and probably most of the world, and it's associated with racing and the curative waters of the springs the spas, and its Victorian architecture and its summertime nightlife. But that Saratoga, the Saratoga that conjures all of those images and all of those places, is Saratoga Springs. It's not the town of Saratoga, the community of Saratoga. In 1745, Saratoga was a small town on the Hudson River, about 8 miles away from Saratoga Springs and a couple of miles south of Schuylerville, New York. It was a lumber town. The lumber business was a big reason for the success of the English colony here in New York. In 1745, 600 French soldiers with Abenaki Indians coming down from Quebec attack the community of Saratoga. It's not well defended at all, and it's because it's such a vital source of wood, of lumber, it becomes a viable target. We don't know exactly what took place there in terms of structures. We know what happened in terms of the battle. There are no visible remains. There are few archaeological artifacts, but there is an account written by the commanding officer of the French, Lieutenant Paul Marin, and in his journal he gives a day-by-day detailed report of his assault on Saratoga, and it makes for very interesting reading. And I pored over that journal to try to figure out, what is he describing? What does this community of Saratoga look like? Well, we know from his description that he attacks north to south and leaves a wake of devastation in his wake. He attacks the blacksmith shop, crosses the Fishkill Creek, attacks the house of Philip Schuyler, not the Philip Schuyler of the Revolutionary War, his uncle, who was also named Philip Schuyler. He's the lord of the land, the squire. His house is attacked. He and his family are murdered. The house is burned. And they continue this path southward, heading for the primary target, which is the mills and the lumber. Marin, in his report, says that 10,000 milled planks were burned. 10,000 planks. That's a lot of lumber. That's an incredible amount of lumber. To give you an idea of that amount of lumber, this is a typical plank from the 1740s. That's what 25 planks look like. 500 planks, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, and that's what 10,000 planks look like. You can only imagine how long it would take to destroy that much lumber, or what kind of a conflagration it would make if you piled it all up and lit it on fire. But that's how much wood was destroyed. All of that lumber was created, all that milled lumber was produced to supply the construction needs in Albany and the ports south of Albany on the Hudson River. And the way they moved this wood from Saratoga downstream was they floated the planks in the inlet. They grouped them together. They bound them into rafts. They would rig the raft with the most basic navigational devices, basically sweep oars, and possibly a hut for shelter for a small crew that would be on board. They had no sails. And these, the rafts were then towed from the inlet out to the Hudson River, and then just cast adrift for the current to carry the raft to Albany. They must have been flexible enough to kind of make their way over the shallows along the way, because they were successful at moving this wood to its destination. This is an English map that was drawn a bit later of that area where the mills were located in Saratoga. And when you look at closely, you can see in this area called Dovegot. It's interesting that they're using a Dutch name for the hook in the river. That's the Hudson River, and you can see the inlet off of the Hudson that leads to the north. In the description on this map, they'd have the date wrong, and they say that the attack took place in 1746, when we know from Marin's detailed journal that it was actually 1745. You can see in the map that they've indicated the locations of some of the main structures, houses and mills. This was helpful to me in trying to figure out how I would organize this painting. From the Google aerial view, you can see the Hudson River and you can see the inlet. Now it's filled in quite a bit over time, but at the northern end of the inlet today, there's a marina. And this would have been the obvious place where those rafts would have been assembled. The terrain hasn't changed all that much over the years. There's a few buildings that have been put there at the marina, but you can get a sense that the water's pretty calm here. You're out of the channel. There aren't terrible currents here, so it's a place where you could work. You could float those boards. You could assemble those rafts pretty easily in this location. So I made a number of sketches. This is one of the final pencil drawings. And I knew the painting was going to include a couple of bateaux, that it would have a raft, that one of the bateaux, one of the larger bateaux with a crew would be towing the raft out toward the Hudson River, that there'd be some kind of storage barn and possibly some mills. This is a detail from the final painting of the mill. Also from the final painting, you can see the raft in the background and a rigged bateau. And this is the final painting. And when I came to do this painting and trying to decide what kind of atmosphere to give the piece, I chose to make the sky threatening because of just knowing what's going to happen to this place in a very short while when the French attack and the mills are burned and the lumber is burned. The Maybe Farm was an interesting project. It's set in Rotterdam, New York, outside of Schenectady. And what makes this project interesting is that those buildings are still there. So it was just a question of trying to figure out what the Maybe Farm may have looked like in the 1700s. There was a main house, there was a kitchen, and there was an outbuilding that was used as a lodge for travelers. In doing the research for the painting, I knew that it was going to have an agricultural feel to it. So I wanted to have a slave plowing a field, and I came across this wonderful artifact at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown. This is a Dutch-style plow from around that time period, very different from what we think of as a plow that would be used to cultivate a field. It doesn't have two handles. It has a kind of tiller. The actual artifact is at the museum. You can visit it. You can see the tiller there. It was operated, it was sort of, the steering was basically the way you would steer a ship or fly an airplane. You moved the stick left or right to control the direction of the plow. Of course, it was being moved along by a team of horses. The slave that I wanted to have in the painting was a man named Cato. He had been owned by the Mabey family and had escaped, and a reward was offered for his capture of $30. And this is the notice that appeared in the Albany newspapers in the late 1790s, offering the reward, but also giving a pretty detailed description of the man himself, the clothes he was wearing, his general stature, and they make a special note in this description to say that he's literate in English and in Dutch. So he's a pretty smart guy. He wasn't able to escape. He was captured, returned to the Mabeys, and eventually winds up on the Mabey farm in Rotterdam. And so he is the character that you see in the painting, operating the plow and tilling the fields. In the background are the structures that I mentioned of the Mabey farm. The location of the barn is conjectural. I know there was a barn in that general vicinity. I don't know what it looked like, or even the size of it, but I know that it was there. The Revolutionary War brings a whole level of chaos again to the area. One of the defining battles of the Revolutionary War was the Battle of Saratoga. There are thousands of wounded during the battle. British wounded, German wounded, American wounded, and all of them are brought to Albany. Albany in the 1750s had built a hospital, a huge hospital. It could accommodate 500 beds. It was built because of the anticipated casualties that were thought to have been the result of the French and Indian War of the 1750s. But that never happened. But the hospital remained in Albany, and after the Battle of Saratoga, it did see an influx, a tremendous influx of wounded, over 1,000. And here they are making their way up to the hospital after the battle. The worst of the wounded are being treated, sort of triaged in the street. This is State Street in Albany. And I don't think it's any coincidence that if you look to the left of the hospital, there's a cemetery. Hospitals were not places that many people had a chance of ever coming out of alive. But I thought it was remarkable that Albany had a hospital of that scale. I think it may have been one of the largest, or possibly the largest hospital in what was then the colonies at the time. George Washington made a couple of trips to Albany. This is a painting that I made of Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Philip Schuyler in Albany. That's the Schuyler Mansion in the background. In 1783, Washington had come to Albany to be given a tour of the site of the Battle of Saratoga. And in this painting, a contingent of Washington's men and Schuyler and Hamilton are escorting Washington down into the town of Albany to meet up with the governor, and then they all made their way up to Saratoga for the tour. After the Revolutionary War, Americans were now free, free of England. They could trade wherever they wanted to, with whomever they wanted to. And one of the heroes of the American Revolution was a man named Stuart Dean. He had been a sloop captain before the war. During the war, he was in command of a vessel that had been engaged in a number of battles with the English. He had been captured at one point and badly wounded, and the Continental Army made a successful trade for Dean, using captured officers, that British officers that they had. This is a drawing of the kind of sloop that would have been in operation shortly after the Revolutionary War. It had a very long bowsprit, it was sort of a short mast. These vessels weren't very big. Stuart Dean had a sloop like this built for him with the idea that he was going to carry cargoes and passengers from Albany to New York. The sloop was a little over 50 feet long, but because America was free and because he was young and he was adventurous, he decided to take his Albany sloop and sail it from Albany to China. An incredible voyage. He had a small crew of 13. 2 of the 13 were boys. We know that one was black and one was white. They were teenagers, and so they set sail from New York. They made their way to the Cape Verde Islands. They rounded the tip of Africa, out across the Indian Ocean, through the Java Straits, and into the China Sea, and eventually made their way to the capital city of Canton. They traded for goods. They had brought goods from New York, including, I think it's really kind of interesting to note that the most prized ginseng root in the world came from New York. It came from the Catskill Mountains. Dean had brought ginseng with him, and the Chinese valued it enough that they traded for they traded silk and fine china for the ginseng. And Dean had also brought Spanish coins with him. That was also used for trade. And he had a bunch of other things. He had furs. He had turpentine. He had some other goods, but his trade was successful. He was there for a while, and then he and the crew of the Experiment sailed back the way they had come, except that when they passed Africa, they made their way out to the Caribbean, and then back to New York, and then back to Albany. Well, I always thought this was a spectacular event, spectacular piece of American history. And so I took on the task of creating a painting of it. I was commissioned by Victor Riley, who at the time was the CEO of KeyBank, and Victor thought big. I mean, he was a larger than life figure, and I really liked him a lot. And Victor said, well, if we're going to do this painting, I want this painting to be big. I want it to be powerful. So the project expanded, and it became the largest painting I've done in my career. In its frame, it's 10 feet long, and it took me a year to paint. And it's basically the Albany that you see in this map. We're looking sort of across the docks. There was an account of Stuart Dean's arrival in New York, where people came out in droves celebrating his journey, and there is no account of what happened here in Albany. So what I did was I kind of mixed the two things together. I took the environment of Albany and the celebration that I know occurred in Manhattan and sort of transplanted it here. Of Stuart Dean's return, his ship, his Albany-built sloop, was named the Experiment. The Experiment was what they were calling the government of the newly formed United States at that time. So here we have the return of the Experiment and his friends and neighbors turning out to give him a hero's welcome. Remarkably, he did not lose one member of his crew during that whole epic journey. I thought I'd conclude the program with an overview of shipbuilding in the late 18th and early 19th century in the upper Hudson River. This is a painting of Water Street in Albany. There was a launchway there. A number of sloops and schooners would have been built on that site. This is also a view of Albany, a little earlier time period. And this is a mix of vessels that would have been constructed at the time of the Revolutionary War, and thereafter Albany is in the misty background. The little vessel in the middle of the painting is Gundello from the war. Hudson, New York has an interesting history. Its past history, when the place was called Claverack Landing, it was basically just a group of warehouses that were used for shipping goods to New York. In its later years, it's a whaling port. It's a town, a community that has a number of shipyards. Within those shipyards, there are 25 brigs constructed over a period of time. This is the brig Liberty. This is the brig Desire. These vessels were used sometimes for whaling, but mostly for hauling cargoes from New York to the Caribbean and back again. This is one of the Hudson whale ships, the Huron, skippered by a survivor of the Essex disaster. If you've ever read In the Heart of the Sea, you know what the Essex did and how the Essex came to its fateful end. Well, this ship was much more successful, and I thought I would end the program today with this view of a Hudson River sloop, typical Hudson River sloop of the early 1800s. By 1820, the era of the sailing vessels on the Hudson River was coming to an end. And that leads us to the end of this chapter and the beginning of the next chapter. And I thought the last slide today would be this view of Schenectady. Schenectady at one time marked the beginning of a very crude canal system to the west of Schenectady out into the wilderness of New York State. But this port eventually became one of the destinations when one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century, the Erie Canal was built. And so that ends the program. The next program, we'll pick up where we left off. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it.
All right. So, Len, now that you've watched it, and before we get to some of the questions that look like have come through the chat box, do you have any thoughts about the recording now that you've had a chance to watch it in its entirety?
Well, I was thinking, to me, the sound seemed a little bit garbly, but we talked about that, and I think I may have worked out that technical problem. But it's a lot easier for me to do these pre-recorded than it is for me to do them live, because when I play back the audio after I've made the recording, I notice, a bunch of pretty obvious and weird mistakes, like in that part about Stuart Dean setting sail for China. I introduced it by saying Stuart Dean sailed across the Pacific Ocean from Albany to Africa, and that's not what happened. So I edited that part out. So yeah, I don't know if I were to make it, might be more exciting if I do it live, but it's annoying to me when I hear it played back and notice things like that.
The first question that came through are just, are there other fine artists who focus on history?
No, I'm the finest of all, really. Well, it's, historical painting. I mean, I guess you could say in the Renaissance that was historical painting, and conjectural painting. Historical events have been painted by artists who didn't live in that time period. I don't know of too many contemporary artists that are doing it, but what got me started on this was that growing up, studying history, I always had a sense that history happened someplace else, that the important stuff happened in London, or happened in New York, or happened in San Francisco, but I felt that maybe those of us who live in these more provincial areas think that our history was not very significant, when all history is significant. And so I think that's what inspired me to take on this career of studying and documenting and visualizing the history that happened where I live, how it got to be what it is. And it isn't less significant history, it's just different history. So that's in a nutshell why I paint what I paint.
There's a question. Do you know how long it took to sail to China during that time period?
Yeah, I think it was 14 months.
14 months.
And the details of that voyage are really interesting. That Stuart Dean's vessel, the Experiment, was the second vessel from the United States to ever sail to China. The first vessel was the Empress of China. It was a large, full-size ship that sailed out of New York. But Dean's 56-foot Albany sloop was the second vessel. And it was kind of a miraculous journey that he could pull that off, that he could actually get that far. And when he got to Canton, it didn't go unnoticed by the Chinese. Now, there were ships there from all over the world that were trading with China, and they were all kept, trying to think of the name of the place. There was a place where the captains and ships had to remain, and then they were escorted into Canton, just the merchants and captains escorted into Canton. But the most powerful figure in China at that time was a man named Hao Qua. And when Hao Qua heard about Dean and Dean's journey in this tiny vessel, he was impressed. He wanted to meet Dean. And so they got together, and Hao Qua gave Dean a private tour of the Forbidden City and gave him a number of mementos. So in addition to the tea and the china and the silk that Dean had on board when he was making his return, he also had these gifts from Hao Qua. So Dean comes all the way back to Albany and has that welcome, that great welcome, and he takes the experiment and he puts it into service as a passenger vessel from Albany to New York City. And it became a very, very popular journey to make. People wanted to go aboard the experiment and make that trip down the river because Dean would explain the gifts that he received from Hao Qua and recount his adventures in China. So, yeah, it's one of those maritime events that is overlooked, I think, sometimes in American history, but nonetheless, I think very significant and very interesting.
So there's a question, after you complete a painting, do you have a difficult time looking at it because you see flaws of the painting?
I thought you were going to ask me if I had a difficult time selling it, which isn't always easy. But give me your question again.
So the question was, after you complete a painting, do you have a difficult time looking at them because you see flaws in paintings?
Yes, I've been painting for a long time, and I have never in my entire career finished a painting that I liked. And I don't know what that is. I think there's an arc to it. Maybe I know there are some artists out there in today's group, but there's an arc to the creative process. When I start a project and it starts to come together, maybe it's the sketching stage or a little bit beyond the conceptual part, I'm thinking, God, this is going to be a masterpiece. This is brilliant. I mean, it's amazing. I'm going to be contacted by the Louvre and the Smithsonian, and I just can't believe how great this is. So that's kind of the beginning part. Then it kind of gets to the middle part and starts to be work. And then I've kind of given up on the Louvre and the Smithsonian, but it still seems like it's going to be okay. And then it's that down slope where it's kind of going toward the end, where I've put in most of the ingredients that are going to go into it. And what I thought was going to be a masterpiece starts to feel like a pretty bad idea. And then I think sometimes by the end, I get to a point where it's like, why did I think this was a good idea when I started it? But so it takes some time. Maybe I look back at them now and I don't hate them as much as I used to.
So there's a question about the arrival of Governor Clinton, and what are the flags, ensigns, pennants that you used on the ship in that painting?
On
the arrival of Governor Clinton in 1748.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the flags. One is just a Union Jack. The other one might be the flag of St. George. It's a pennant. And those flags. I mean, Abraham Dow was a skipper of a merchant vessel. I mean, his daily routine, he wouldn't be hosting celebrity like that. So Dow probably would carry maybe no flags on his vessel if he was in the Hudson River. But the governor wanted to make an impression when he made his journey up here, and so that's why he paid Dow to have those flags made and then have them prominently presented on the journey. The journey was, it was a show. I mean, Clinton wanted to impress people, mostly the Indians, with whatever he was, with the gifts, with the journey itself, with his presence. There's a side story to this that I find sort of fascinating. Charlie Gehring, my good friend and great historian, we've had a conversation about this. You recall the burning of Saratoga, that story that I told about how Saratoga was attacked and destroyed in the 1740s. There was a fort in Saratoga, a fort with bastions and barracks and places where it could be armed with cannons. And that fort was completely empty. There were no soldiers there. And Schuyler, who was the sort of the lord of the land up there, Schuyler wanted the provincial governor, who was Clinton down in Albany, to provision the fort and supply it with soldiers. And Clinton refused to do it. Clinton felt that Schuyler, being a rich man, should supply his own security to the fort. So consequently, it was left unoccupied, and that's what led to the destruction of Saratoga. So there was a strange friction that was going on between Clinton, the provincial governor, and Schuyler, who was trying to maintain this lumbering community in Saratoga.
Let's see there. Do you have any works in the Smithsonian yet?
It's funny. I think maybe in the end, when time goes by and all of us are part of history, maybe the most important thing that I own that will wind up in the Smithsonian might be my snowblower.
Somebody said, what is fascinating is how you can bring to life 2D maps to 3D images with human activity. Have there ever been any contentious issues that you have felt uncomfortable about, and how have you dealt with that?
Okay, so there's a couple of parts to this. One is, when I see those maps, I see them as three-dimensional space. So I don't see them as two-dimensional. When I look at the map, I can see the dock. I can imagine how it's getting used. I can see the organization of streets. I get a sense of the texture of a place. So that map is very, very much alive to me. It becomes more credible when I find 2 or 3 maps done by different cartographers in slightly different time periods that show the same, that give the same information. That's what makes me confident that what they are depicting was actually there. The most uncomfortable that I feel about a subject is when I don't have a document like that. In some cases, it's it might be just a verbal record of a place, or a bit of archaeology that was discovered. I'm working on a project a little bit like that right now. At the northern end of Central Park in Manhattan, in the 1630s. Now, the 1630s in Manhattan is really early. What's happened in Manhattan by that time is that down at the tip of Manhattan is a community, New Amsterdam. There's a Dutch fort there. They've built a wall, which is Wall Street today, but at that time it was a wall to protect themselves against the hostile Indians that lived north of the tip of Manhattan. But in 1637, two brothers, Isaac and Henry de Forest, for some reason, acquired permission to build a farm at almost the northern end of Manhattan, actually like 2/3 of the way up, which is where Central Park meets Harlem today. It's a nasty area because of the confluence of the waters there. The Hudson River is on the western side of Manhattan. On the eastern side is the East River that goes about 2/3 of the way up the island. The Harlem River is coming in from the Hudson and meets the East River at a place called Hellgate. And that area, there are whirlpools there and rocks. It's a difficult place to navigate. And it's just a short distance from there that the Forest built this farmstead. And it's built a little bit like kind of a crude fort. It reminds me a little, when the stockade that they build is described, it reminds me of the painting that I did for Historic Huguenot Street of the structure, the Huguenot structure in New Paltz. It's very basic, and so all I have are a couple of references to this place, and I'm making a painting which is completely speculative. So what can I say about a piece like that is I guarantee there is absolutely 100, there's zero possibility that it looks like my painting, zero. But what I'm trying to get, and what I try to get when I'm working on a speculative piece like that, is the texture. Am I creating a credible texture? It may not look like this, but hopefully it felt like this. The perception of the architecture or the way it's organized, I'm hoping that I'm getting that feeling right. So I guess what I worry about is that people sometimes take what I do as fact. They're not photographs. I try to make them as accurate as I can, and but they are still filtered through my imagination. And as hard as I try to be objective.
So once again, I want to thank you, Len, and thank everybody who was able to join us this afternoon.
Before we go, Pat, I just want to add that I love to hear your comments. So please, if you feel like you want to ask me a question or comment on today's program or have a suggestion, please email me. My email address is lftantillo@gmail.com. And if you forget that, you can go to my website and you can use the email address that I have on the website. But I definitely would love to hear from you. So if you have an interest or a question, please don't hesitate.
And I just typed it in the chat box too. So before you leave today, if you do want to, you can go ahead and just copy and paste it and have it for later. So once again, everybody, thank you. Thank you for spending the time with us this afternoon. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.